Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma daf Kaf Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Diana Bloom in loving memory of her grandmother, Ita Rosa Sana Ben Maramek, on her yahrzeit. Her strong character, fierce determination to her family, unwavering Zionism, and commitment to the Jewish community, both in Buenos Aires and globally, continue to serve as a role model and inspiration. Okay, and hoping for better news these days. We really need our tefillot. Okay, we are going to start now with continuing our sugya about someone who's living in someone else's property. Do they, without permission, do they need to pay rent or not? Okay, so we have someone in a case, we already said, where it's not up for rent at all. And so you have a squatter, they found a plot of land, they start living there, some house, and basically we're still struggling with yes or no. So what we saw is that most people, we saw yesterday, Rabbi Ami said, what did he do? Machisro, ma'aziko, he didn't make him lose anything, he didn't damage anything, so why would we make the person pay? Then we saw this machloket between Rav Kahana and the neighbor of Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Abahu and the neighbor of Rabbi Yochanan, whether yes or no. But then we basically said that Rabbi Abahu said yes, he has to pay, actually was misunderstood Rabbi Yochanan. That's where we ended yesterday, because he used the case of Me'ila. And then they said, oh, the case of Me'ila is not Shalom Midato. It's not the same case. And then we explained it like Tosfot at the end of the daf, that really it's considered God knows. And God said, if you use my property, in other words, you're going to have to compensate me. That's the law of Me'ila. So therefore, it's basically like a case, which we already said is obvious you have to pay. If you're living in someone's property and they say, no way, no how are you allowed to live here? And you live there anyway, of course you have to pay. So that wasn't a good example, and it wasn't the same scenario. So we seem to be in our sugya today is also going to be in the direction of the squatter actually doesn't really have to pay. So Shalach le Rabbi Abba bar Zavda l'Mari bar Mar, ba minei Rav Huna, hadar b'chatzar chavero shelo midato tzarich la'lo sachar o lo. While I will say that the sugya seems to indicate you do not have to pay, what we also see throughout this sugya is that this was a question that troubled people for generations. We keep hearing people asking this question, what's the story? Here, basically, Rabbi Abba bar Zavda sends to Mary bar Mar, please ask Rav Huna the following question. Well, by the time he goes to ask him the question, Adahachi nach nafshei de Rav Huna, says Rav Huna died. So we never got to ask Rav Huna. However, the best way we can find out what Rav Huna thought is his son. So Amarle Rabba bar Rav Huna. Rabba bar Rav Huna said, well, Hachi Amar Abba. This is what my father said about it. Abba Mary, Mishmei de Rav. Okay, my father said it in the name of Rav. Okay, next sugya we're going to see the same thing. Either Rav said it or Rav Huna said it, and it seems to be the same. It's going to be the same idea, just a different discussion that was going on. Eino tzarich la'lo lo sachar. Number one, he says, don't have to pay rent. Then he says, Ba'asocher bayit miruven ma'aleh sachar l'shimon. He says something totally incomprehensible. Someone who rents a house from Reuven has to pay rent to Shimon. Okay, that makes no sense. Shimon, my avidate. What is Shimon doing there? If it's Reuven's house, of course he has to pay rent to Reuven. What do you mean? You rented the house from Reuven. What are you doing paying to Shimon? To which the Gemara says what he meant to say was, Hachi kamar, nimtza habayit shel Shimon ma'alelo sachar. If it turned out the house was Shimon's, you rent a house from Reuven, and then it turns out that Reuven wasn't really the owner. He was a squatter on the land, and it wasn't really his. It was Shimon's, then you have to pay Shimon. To which the Gemara says, Tarte, wait a minute. Those two things contradict each other. In the first line, you said if you're a squatter, you don't have to pay. In the second one, basically, we're saying if you're basically the squatter from the squatter, because you're renting from a squatter, and you would think theoretically, if Reuven didn't have to pay, then you wouldn't have to pay either, right? So they say no. It's two different types of situations we're discussing here, and this goes back to what we saw before. The whole discussion was only in a place where we said you're benefiting, but the person whose house it is isn't losing out. Now they're only not losing out if they're not planning to ever rent the space, or not planning at that given moment to rent the space. But if they were renting the space, and Shimon was trying to rent his place, but Reuven took it over and was renting it as if he was the owner. So if that's the case, if it was a house that was meant to be rented, then Shimon's losing out by the fact that Reuven paid collected money. And that's why if you rent it from Reuven, but it turns out it was Shimon, you're going to have to pay Shimon, because that's a case where it was meant to be rented and you're actually causing a loss. And we're going to see the exact same thing. And this is what I said. Previous sugya was Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, and really we were learning this all from Rabba bar Rav Huna, his son. Same thing, Itmar Nami, it was also said, and it's going to be the exact same gist with a minor difference. Not a significant difference. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Avin Amar Rav. So Rabbi Chia bar Avin says it in the name of Rav. Okay, before it was Rav Huna saying in the name of Rav. Or Amrila, some people say Amar Rabbi Chia bar Avin Amar Rav Huna. Some people say he said in the name of Rav Huna. Hadar b'chatzar chavero shelo midato ino tzarich la'alot lo sachar. Okay, maybe perhaps because this was all, we didn't hear directly from Rav Huna. This is why the Sugya is telling you, well, Rabba bar Rav Huna said it in the name of Rav Huna, and also Rabbi Chia bar Avin said it in the name of Rav Huna, or perhaps even in the name of Rav. It's a way to strengthen that. Don't think this isn't true, but we also have someone else who said it. So again, there's going to be two lines. One is Hadar b'chatzar chavero shelo midato eino tzarich la'alot lo sachar. You live in someone's property without their knowledge, you don't have to pay them rent. Ve'hasocher mibnei ha'il ma'aleh sachar leba'alim. And if you're socher, I skipped the word bayit. You're socher bayit, you rent a house from the city. Okay, it sounds like from the municipality of the city. Ma'aleh sachar leba'alim. You pay the rent to the owner. To which again, the Gemara asked, Ba'alim ma'avidatai, what owner? Didn't you just say you rented it from the city, as if the city owned it? Hachi Kamma. Nimsu'u lo ba'alim, ma'alim lehem sachar. This is, by the way, a little different. It's not exactly a squatter, but it sounds like the city took it over because nobody was renting it, and then they didn't know who the owner was, and then someone came forward and proved, oh, we're the owners, then you pay the rent to the owner, even though your contract was with the city. So again, tarte, doesn't this seem to contradict? The first one seems like, right, if it's ownerless and you're not a loss for anybody, you don't have to pay anybody. The second seems to indicate, this wasn't a loss for anybody. It didn't even have owners. So, again, was it a house that was being rented, or was it a house that wasn't being rented? If it's a house that's being rented, then yes, it's a loss for the owner. It's true, he hadn't proven he was the owner, but it was his, and therefore it was a loss for him. And if it's not, and therefore you would have to pay. If it's not a house that's generally being rented, then you don't have to pay. Okay, so that's just, again, this clearly seems to indicate the psak halacha, the prevalent psak halacha is, if you're living in someone's property and they weren't planning to rent it. So if we then say, I would even say even more than this, any case where you're benefiting, but the other person isn't losing anything from your benefit, you wouldn't have to pay. Amar Rav Schora, but now, and this is why I set this up right now, that this seems to be the classic example. But now we're going to have two explanations as to why this case might be unique. And it might not indicate that every time we're you don't have to pay. And here there's two unique reasons, and then we'll say what's the difference between the two reasons. Amar Rav Schora, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav. Hadar b'chatzar chavero shelo midato ein tzarich la'alot lo sachar. Okay, we're done with this, right? We've seen this already many times. You don't have to pay rent. Mishum shene'emar shi'iya yukat sha'al. Because it says in a pasuk in Yeshayahu, Nish'al ba'ir shama shi'iya yukat sha'al. If you're left in a city with nothing, desolate, what happens when things are desolate? Comes in the shi'iya. Shi'iya will attack the gates. Shi'iya is the name of an evil spirit. This is what, right? We grew up with haunted houses, right? This is a haunted house. You leave a house with nothing. Everyone, there's this fear of haunted houses. In the words of the Gemara, that's called evil spirits. We're worried about evil spirits. So basically, we say, Ushiya yukat sha'al, and therefore you're actually helping the owner by living there. And that's why you don't have to pay rent. Your rent is that you're preventing, right? You're doing them a favor by living there. People don't like their houses being left empty. He says, and it's kind of funny, they say it in our Masechet, in our chapter right here. He says, I've seen this shi'iya, and it gores like an ox. Okay, funny, because that's all we've been talking about. Ox is goring. It gores like an ox. It's a super dangerous evil spirit, so you're actually really doing something important. Rabbi Yosef Amar, Beit HaMiyat V'Yativ. Rabbi Yosef says there's a different reason, which is if you settle in a house, you're going to see all the problems that are coming and you're going to fix them. We all know what happens. If you leave a house for a long time, it's not good because things start breaking and nobody's fixing them and the house starts to deteriorate. And then to fix up the whole thing after, let's say a year of nobody living there, it becomes much more of a mess and much more complicated and a huge loss. So it's actually helpful to have someone living there, and then they see what the problems are and then they fix them. That's great. So you're actually helping the owner. And that's why you don't have to pay rent. Now, it doesn't exactly add up to the amount of rent, but still, person wasn't renting it anyway, and you're actually being helpful to them. What's the difference? If you left it, if it was a storehouse for wood, for hay, straw, if it was a storehouse, then because it's full, there won't be evil spirits wandering around there. Okay, because it's full, and let's say once in a while somebody walks in, and maybe that's why, for whatever reason, a full house, right? It's not empty, and therefore there won't be evil spirits there, and therefore you won't be helping if that's the case, if the evil spirit is the issue. But if it's a storehouse, the owner is not going to be coming back there to check on the status of the house very much. The house might deteriorate and fall apart, but if you live there, you'll actually be helping. Gavra. Now there's a story. I want to just refresh your memory before we start this story. Rav Nachman is going to appear in our story. If you remember, he's the son-in-law of the Reish Galuta. And Daf Yubet, we had a story where people, these wealthy creditors, were trying to get money back from orphans, and they collected something they weren't allowed to collect from orphans. Remember, you can only collect land that the father had at the time. They collected metaltalin that they weren't allowed to collect, movable property. And Rav Nachman got very upset with them and said, basically, give them back what you collected. Otherwise, I'm going to take away your palaces. Okay. And it seemed to be, and we're going to see now that we have another very similar story where there's wealthy people taking advantage of orphans, and comes Rav Nachman to the rescue. Okay. And it's interesting to think about why Rav Nachman was the one who did this, and probably thinking more about it than the previous time. Remember, he was the son-in-law of the exilarch, who was very wealthy, which means that he was very familiar with the wealthy people and probably was well respected by the wealthy people, which meant that he was in a position where some of the rabbis, maybe the wealthy people would just ignore them, but he was a prominent person also in their community and was able to therefore put them in their place and say, hey, listen, this is not fair. Do not take advantage of orphans. And what's nice about it is, you see, he went out to bat for the weaker people in society and trying to help them. So what happens in our story? So this person builds, he takes a spot that was like the garbage heap of the orphans. He builds his palace right there. Okay, he figures out the orphans, what are they going to do, right? It seems to be, even though you don't see this, but probably the orphans didn't even know. It could be land they didn't even know they had. Or you could say maybe orphans don't have knowledge at all to even know. So we have to have it a case of shalom midato, otherwise it doesn't make sense. We want it to fit into someone's living in someone's property without their knowledge. So again, either they're too young, they don't have knowledge, or they just didn't know because it was some plot of their fathers that they had no idea existed maybe. This is the kind of the topic sentence. This is the end of the story. And we're going to have to figure out the details and how he got to this. So Rav Nachman basically confiscated their palaces that they built there. Okay, this guy's palace that he built. Okay, so in the other story, it was all these creditors. He says, I'm going to take your palaces. Here, he actually confiscates the palace because they were taking advantage of the orphans. To which the Gemara says, from here, what can you infer? Lema kasava Rav Nachman, or that's really a question. Could you really think that Rav Nachman holds, Hadar b'chatzar chavero shalom midato tzarich la'alo lo sachal? Does he disagree with most of the people that we saw and think that, look, they were benefiting, even though it was no loss to the orphans, because the orphans weren't doing anything with that land. They didn't even know they had it probably. And look, it says they have to pay. To which they say no. You can't necessarily assume that again, because no one else really seemed to think that. There were some people living there, Karmonaim, from this area in southern Iran, and they were living in the property, and they were giving a small amount of money. Okay, this raises a question: how could it have been Shalom Midat HaYatomim then? But maybe the Yatomim didn't know that these people that this person had moved in and built a palace there. So now we have they were actually making, obviously not the kind of rent they could charge for these palaces, but they were making a little bit of money. Davar mu'at, they were paying something. These were nomads, by the way, these Karmonaim. That's how they got from Iran to here. And they were giving them a little bit of money. Amarle, zil paisinu leatme. So the way the story went was like this. He said, listen, you took over from the Karmonaim and you built a nice palace there. Well, go appease the Yatomim, okay? Go figure out, give them some sort of, offer them something Velo eshkach. And the rich guy just said, I don't care. And that's why he confiscated the palace. Okay. And he basically said, until you pay, this palace is mine. Or maybe he gave it to the orphans. We don't know. Now, there's a big debate among the commentaries. How much rent do they need to pay, right? Rent of a palace is very expensive. On the other hand, right, it was on a garbage dump, and it's not like the orphan did this. I see you're asking where was the court. Rav Nachman was the court. He was the court. Okay, he functioned. He had his own court. Okay, so anytime he rules, it's basically like the court ruling. So anyway, Tosfot says, "Im yave liyatme davar mu'at umachmach ken chayav l'shalem ma shenehene." They have to pay rent for like rent of where you would, like a land you would build a palace on, not a garbage dump rent. Even though they really didn't cause a big loss, okay, they actually had to pay like a full price. Other commentaries say, what are you talking about? They had to pay the davar mu'at that the karmonim would have paid. That's what they had to pay. They didn't have to pay like the real value, which is also an interesting discussion about, here they had money and they were using it for something that was worth a lot of money. Question is, what were they causing a loss of? Does it go by what they caused the loss of, or does it go by what their benefit was? And they benefited a lot because they ended up with this great plot of land that they turned into a nice plot of land. On the other hand, it's a good question, and it's an interesting debate among the commentaries how to view. Okay, that was first sugya for today. So we now finished with Arba Chatar Chavero Shalom Mid'ato. I'm going to summarize it right now. We won't summarize it at the end. We basically saw that the gist is, if it wasn't a place that was up for rent, you probably, according to most commentaries, you don't have to pay rent at all. Okay, or which means, right, do we learn from here to everything? Or perhaps as we learned from the end there, maybe it's really only in a house or a situation where it's actually advantageous to the person that you're actually living there, whereas it might not necessarily be the case in other situations. Now we're going to move on to the next sugya, which is the Mishna distinguished, if you remember, between mashe nehenet and mashe zika, okay, which are code words for, okay, where in the public domain are you liable for shen and where are you not? In general, in the public domain, we said you don't have to pay for shen damages. Your animal eats, that's just expected. Someone left their food there, they're tough luck. And that's called mishalei mashe nehenet, because you really don't have to pay. However, if you benefited, so you're going to have to pay the small amount of benefit that you got based on the rate of barley or the rate of hay. Okay. Then we move on to the tzidei reshut rabim. There's places in the public domain. We had, on the camel's back, if you remember, or whatever animal's back, we had, certain cases where it's like a reshut yachid in reshut rabim. And the Mishnah had distinguished between two things. One is the main drag, and the sides. The sides were kind of like sidewalks, probably, a little higher even maybe. And that was, if you go to the cardo, there's the areas like beyond the pillars, and there it was in front of the stores. So we also saw in front of the store, which is considered public, and the inside the store, which is private. Okay. And also the sides are considered private domains. So therefore, if your animal eats there, well, it's not right. Your animal wasn't supposed to eat there. Someone's allowed to put their food out there, and therefore you're going to be liable. So now we end up with a big machloket, Rav and Shmuel, and we're going to actually have a machloket, what the machloket is about. So the first reading is this. Amarav. Okay, so ketzam shalem et mashe nehenet, and that was, right, when do you pay only what you benefited? That's achla mitoch harechava. Okay, but mitzidei harechava, if it's on the side, then you have to pay whatever you damaged. You're going to have to replace whatever it was you ate. Even if it was expensive food, you're going to have to return the expensive food. So now, again, mashe nehenet just means you're really not liable for damages. You just have to fill in for what you benefited, if you benefited. But if you didn't, then not at all. And mashe zika means you have to pay. Chayav. So theoretically, it's like saying patur and chayav. Okay? Because it's a little confusing to keep going over the word mashe nehenet, mashe zika. If you just think of every time we say mashe nehenet, it means you're exempt because it's public. And mashe zika is going to be your liable. So Amarav, b'machazeret. Okay, not only are you exempt if you're walking in the public domain, but if the animal turns its head and eats something from the side, you're also exempt. Okay, because that's basically the animal's expected to do that, because that's what animals do. They walk and they turn their heads. Shmuel Amar, afilu mechazeret nami patur. He says, no. Oh, sorry, I think I just did it wrong. sorry, my mistake. I just got it wrong. Uba mechazeret is actually, it's confusing because it started ketzam shalem at masha nene. Really, they're talking about mashi zika. Okay, I explained Shmuel right now by accident. Okay, Rav says b'mechazeret you're also liable. Okay, meaning we said you're liable if you eat from the sides of the side. Comes Rav and he says if your animal eats from the side but is still in the public thoroughfare, meaning their body's in the main drag, but they turn their heads to the side, you're liable for that. Why are you liable? Exact opposite reason I said, because the person who puts their food there doesn't expect the animal to eat it. So the fact that the animal ate it, well, it's the animal's fault, right? But Shmuel says, afilu mechazeret nami patur. You're also going to be exempt from mechazeret because, again, that's what I said before, thinking it was Rav. Shmuel says, when you're walking, the animal's walking, they turn their heads and they eat things from the side. So don't leave your things in a place where the animal could just turn their head and eat it. You know, yes, like you're in the store, that's protected, but the sides, okay, now we're going to have a problem because the Mishna said in the sides, you have to pay. So the Shmuel, so where would you be chayav? If the animal turns its head to the side, then you don't have to pay. Then when does the animal on the side have to pay? Okay, what the case is, there's three cases. Animals walking in the main thoroughfare, everyone agrees, exempt. Okay, eats, walking straight ahead, eats stuff left on the ground. Animal turns its head, machloket Rav and Shmuel. Okay, Rav says you're liable because you're still because you're eating in the private area. Shmuel says you're exempt because you're still in the public area. And when you're going to be chayav, according to everybody, this is the only case Shmuel is going to say you're going to be chayav, if the animal walks into the side area and while he's in the side area eats, then you'll be liable. Okay, so that's the case for Shmuel. This is going to be the exact repeat. It's just instead of referring to the Mishnah, where Rav says, and b'mechazeret also, you're going to be liable. Instead, they just said it as an independent statement, not connected to our Mishnah. They were just having a discussion. Rav, but it's the same concept. Mechazeret, what's the law if the animal's walking and turns its in the main drag and turns its head? Rav amar chayevet, Shmuel amar p'tura. And then they ask the question, so how are you going to have a case where you're liable? If you actually got up, the animal got up, walked entirely into the side, and while it was there, ate. That's atypical. Okay, so that's the exact same thing. Mativ, it's just, was it said about our Mishnah, or was it just said as a discussion, not necessarily connected to our Mishnah, even though obviously it connects to our Mishnah? Now we're going to have a question on Rav. Mativ Rav Nachman, he says there's a problem with Rav according to our Mishnah, because the second line after this, the Mishnah distinguished between the main drag, where you're exempt, and the sides where you're liable. According to Rav, the next line doesn't make sense. It says, Mi petach hachanut mishalem emasha ne'eneh. If you're in the entrance to the store, you pay only what you benefited, meaning you're exempt. If you're inside the store, then you're going to pay full damages. So, what's going to be the case of petach chanut? Is that not pshita b'mechazeret? What else is the entrance to the store if not that the animal turns its head from the main drag? Because the petach chanut is always right next to the main drag. So what would it be if not that the animal turns its head to the entrance to the store? V'ka'amar masha ne'eneh, and it says masha ne'eneh, which seems to imply masha ne'eneh imashi zikalo, which basically means you're not liable for damages, only if the animal now doesn't need to eat lunch. But you're not really liable for the damages you cause. Classic, Rishut Rabim. But it's not Rishut Rabim. And according to Rav, you're only exempt really in the main drag. If the animal turns its head and eats, you're going to be liable. So how could this be? Hu motiv la v'hu mefarek la dekayma b'keren zavit. Okay, so now we're going to say it must be the reason why you're exempt here is because it was in a corner. Now, Rashi explains it's not really a corner. The way Rashi explains it, and if you have a regular Gemara, there's a diagram. Rashi probably didn't write these diagrams, but whoever printed it put a diagram in for Rashi. There's a big space, and then it gets narrower. And the petach, in other words, the main drag just continues, but it narrows. It's like an alleyway. And the store is jutting out. And when the animal walks by, they really have no choice but to, notice the food and eat it. In that case, the animal's not going to be liable. That's what we're talking about petach chanut. Petach chanut is a case where it's basically part of the main drag. Okay. And again, if you put your wares out there, you know an animal is going to come by. It's your fault for putting it out there. And that's why the animal is going to be exempt. But that doesn't raise a question to Rav, because Rav basically said, if it's mechazeret, then you're liable full damages. This isn't mechazeret. This is different. This is where the animal's walking straight and just kind of barges into it and eats it. Now, some people say that this wasn't the machloket Rav and Shmuel. The machloket Rav and Shmuel was about something entirely different. It's not a totally different topic, but something else about shen. And it had to do with public and private also. Okay, we have some sort of issue with them about being in the public space and having a debate whether something is defined as public or private, but it was something else. So some people say, everybody thinks animal turns its head is liable. The machloket is about if I take my space, my public space that's next to the Reshut HaRabim, and I say, you know what? I'm going to sell stuff out of my house, and I'm going to open the big area in front of my house and make it public property. I'm going to basically say this is ownerless property, and I put my stuff out there to sell. So I make like a vegetable stand, let's say, right in my private domain, which I basically say is now a public domain, and everyone can walk in here and everyone can come. So now you can see where the question is, because it's sort of Reshut HaYachid, it's sort of Reshut HaRabim, right? Because I've made it, the question is, does it now have status of Reshut HaRabim, that an animal that eats there, I have to expect the animal will eat there? Or is it somehow still my own private domain for this purpose? So, Hachi Yitmar, Amarav, Lo Shanu Ela Mechazeret. Aval, in other words, now, Lo Shanu, you're going to be liable only Mechazeret. But, right, because again, Mechazeret, you're liable according to Rav. This goes back to the beginning, because Rav said, right, he turned its head. That's like the animal walking. Reshut HaRabim, anyone who has their stuff on the side that the animal can just turn their head and get into it, obviously the animal's going to get there. First of all, my stand isn't exactly on the main drag. It's kind of off because it was originally private property. So since it was originally private property, perhaps it's not expected the animal's going to eat there, and therefore, if the animal does eat, we're going to be responsible. The owner's going to be responsible. But Shmuel Amal, okay, Shmuel says, what do you mean? It now becomes, right, I'm sorry, did I just say, oh, I said it wrong. I did it again. I don't know why. Okay, let's go back to Rav. Lo shanu ela mechazeret. Mechazeret, you're going to be liable because, sorry, I can't believe I said the same mistake again. There's something stuck in my head. So Rav is going to say mechazeret, when the animal turns its head, that's already going out into the private domain. Okay, and therefore you're liable for full damages. But if I turn my space into public property, then that becomes public property, and public property has a rule of Reshut HaRabim. And Shmuel says, no, it's really still on the side, and it was my private domain, so the animal isn't expected to go there because the animal isn't expected. If it does, then the animal's owner is going to be liable. So now they say, maybe they have the same machloket here that they do with a boar in the same situation. Now, before we get into this, let's just review. Shen in the public domain is exempt because, again, expectation is the animal is going to eat. So if you left your fruits there, you're tough luck. Expectation with boar is the opposite. Boar in the public domain is a hazard. Someone's going to fall in. It's your fault for digging a boar. If it's in the private domain and you come in, your shore comes into my house and falls into my pit, that's your shore's fault. What were you doing coming into my domain? So whereas shen is exempt in the public domain, boar is liable. So now they're going to say, let's say that their same argument holds, but the flip. In other words, if you view this as Reshut HaRabim for sure, your space that you just made public like Rav does, then you're going to view it and then you're going to be exempt. You're going to view it as boar, which is in the public domain, which you're going to be liable. And if you think it's private, because it was private to begin with, then you'll say when it comes to boar, you're not liable. When it comes to shen, you are liable. So it's going to be the flip, but the same logic, okay? If you call it Reshut HaRabim, you call it Reshut HaRabim, both for boar and for shen, which is going to have opposite conclusions, but it's the same idea. So, Rav Amar Patul, if you say here you're exempt, kasavar bor b'rishuto chayav. Right? You're going to say, why are you exempt? Because it's public domain. So if it's a bor, if I dig a pit in my property and then I open up my property and say, hey, this is now public property, and someone falls in, I'm going to be liable because we're treating this as public property, both for shen and for bor. Shmuel amar chayav kasavar bor b'rishuto patur. And Shmuel, who says, right, you're liable when it comes to the shen, because we view this as private property, is going to say when it comes to bor, you're going to be exempt because we view it as private property. To which the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. And now we're going to explain it according to Rav, and we're going to explain it according to Shmuel why it wouldn't be the same. Amar lecha Rav. Rav would say, again, we want to say both shen you're going to be exempt because we're going to view it as public, but when it comes to bor, we're going to view it as private, and you're going to be exempt as well. Amar lecha Rav. La'olam ema lecha ba'alma bor b'rishito patur. Really, bor on your own rishut is exempt. Now, why is bor b'rishito exempt? So Rashi says, because the Torah was really only mechayev on a bor b'rishut harabim. And if you remember, we keep saying about bor, we're now in Amud by the way, we keep saying about bor that bor is tfilat asiyato l'nezik. Remember that from the first tapim? From the moment I dug it, it was dangerous. Now, in my own property, it's not dangerous because this is my own private property. But in the public sphere, it's very dangerous. So in this case, I dug it in a way that wasn't dangerous. So the fact that later I made it ownerless doesn't really matter because it wasn't, right? And this, you could sort of say it's exerat hakachut, like they learned from the pasuk that it was, you made the bor and it was already dangerous, but it wasn't in your own domain. So that's why if it was originally in your reshut and you made it public, you're exempt. But in this case, now that I made my space public, I can't, you basically, if I made my space public and your shore eats my fruits, you could say, I'm not going to pay you. You put your stuff now in the public domain and my shore ate it. What? That was your fault, you're going to tell me, for putting your fruits out in the public domain. The fact that I made my thing ownerless, so when it comes to bor, we can't make me liable because I dug it in a way that was permitted. Now that I made it ownerless, that's not bor anymore. Okay, it is technically, and that's going to be obviously Shmuel. It's going to say the opposite, but it is an obstacle, but it's not done in the way bor normally is done, right? Even of no sakino masao, when I place it in the public domain, that's when tchilat asiyato l'nezek. When I put it down, in this case, I didn't put it in rishut harabim. I put it in my own domain. I just turned my domain into rishut harabim, so that becomes a different issue. But when it comes to the food, how can you possibly make the owner of the animal liable for food? If I open my space and said anyone can walk here, well, then what did I expect? Of course, animals are going to walk there and eat my stuff. So I can't claim damages. That would be rough. So in which case, they're not necessarily connected. Ushmuel amal, be'alma bor b'rishuto chayav. Okay, bor for sure is chayav because you put an obstacle in the public domain. Tibishlama bor ikalamemra lavadate. Now, bor, what's the problem with the obstacle of bor? It's not noticeable because it's below ground, right? So the animal's walking and falls right in, okay? Won't even notice. You can't expect an animal to notice it because an animal's eyes don't go all the way down, right? It goes kind of like on an angle forward. So you can't expect the animal to see it. But you can't say the animals didn't see the fruits. They do. They see the fruits. And therefore the fruits, you're supposed to watch the animal. And the animal's supposed to know, oh, I see fruits, right? I'm not supposed to eat them. And therefore, you could theoretically, that's why Shmuel says the animal is liable for the fruits because he should have seen they were there and known that he shouldn't be eating them. Okay, it's a little bit tricky because how's the animal supposed to distinguish between what they can eat and what they can't eat? This line is a little bit tricky. In fact, Rashi even takes it to a different place. Rashi says if it were fruit like banana peels that you could slip on, you wouldn't, the animal wouldn't be liable because the owner of the bor wouldn't be liable because the fruit can be seen by the animal. The animal should have noticed and avoided them. And then it becomes the responsibility of the owner of the shore. It's his fault that he tripped. Okay, because it doesn't make so much sense in terms of the liability for the eating. But in any case, we'll leave it at that. Now, so we had two ways of understanding Rav and Shmuel. Either they have a machloket about mechazeret, when the animal's going through the main drag and turns its head. Do we still view it as if it's in the main drag and is exempt, or do we view it as no, he ate on the side, we're going to make him liable? Second one was, what if we have this case where somebody takes and by the way, according to this, I'll just remind you, everyone agrees that you're liable for mechazeret because anyone on the side is allowed to have their fruits there. The question is, what if someone took their domain and turned it into public? So it was private, but became public. Do we view it as private still, or do we view it as public still for this issue? Is it the same as bor? No, we said not necessarily. Now they're going to say, Lema mechazeret tanaihi. Maybe the whole thing about mechazeret is a machloket between Tanaim. We're now going to quote this Tanaitic source, which is very incomprehensible. And at least the second opinion, we're not going to understand what it means. And in the end, they're going to have three suggestions to what it means. First, they're going to think it means this issue, and that they have an opinion against the first opinion about mechazeret specifically. Then they're going to say, no, it could be this. And then they're going to reject that. And then they're going to suggest a third, which the other two have nothing to do really with mechazeret or not. But we brought it because of this. Lema mechazeret tonight. So maybe let's go back and think. Rav and Shmuel have a machloket about mechazeret. Well, maybe before them, the Tanaim also disagreed about it. Ditanya. Just to remind you, we had this other source about the tarnagol that hops, and we had muad, ena muad, and we had a number of, because it wasn't clear what it meant, we tried to suggest a bunch of different things, what it could possibly mean. It's the same thing with this bright. It's a bright that we don't really know what it means, and then they basically plug in, oh, maybe it means this, maybe it means that. So, okay, this we know, right? You eat from the middle of the street, you have to pay only the benefit you got. You're not really liable otherwise. Okay, this is, we know exactly what this means. If you eat on the side of the road, you have to pay what you damaged, meaning chayav in damages. Divrei Rabbi Meir ve Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, now we learned that this opinion we saw in our Mishna is Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi ve Rabbi Elazar omrim ein darka le'echol ela lahalech. The simple, when I first read this is going to be explanation number 2. This is how I read. In fact, I said to myself before I got to the continuation, I said, this sounds like a whole different approach to shen in Rishut Rabim. Like new, not anything we've seen until now, meaning going against everything we learned, which is the animal's way is not to eat, just to walk. An animal walking on the street walks, doesn't eat. And therefore what? Therefore, you'll be liable for shen in Rishut Rabim because it's not expected. Once it's not expected, then we're going to say, oh, well, you left your fruits there. You didn't think the animal was going to eat it. So if the animal does eat it, it turns back into my fault because my animal ate your fruits. So that's what it sounds like he's saying. But they don't think that right now because that goes against everything we learned about shen and Rishut Rabim, which we thought was so obvious. Now, it doesn't mean it's not true. It could be. There's just a Tanaitic opinion that nobody really quotes much that really does have a whole different approach to shen. So Rabbi Yossi, Hainu Tanakama. So the first thing they say is, it actually sounds similar to Tanakama, meaning we don't really know what this means, okay? Might mean like on the sides of the road. We don't know exactly, but they think maybe it sounds the same. Therefore, they say, the difference must be mechazeret, okay? Where we're going to say, Tanakama savar mechazeret nami mishalem mashaneh. As long as you're walking in the main drag, even if you move your head, you're still exempt. Rabbi Yossi savar mishalem mashizika. And Rabbi Yossi says, no, you're going to have to pay your damages because ein darka le'echol, turning its head. That's what you would say, basically. It's not generally, usually it just walks, meaning it doesn't turn its head to the side, you could say. And therefore, if it does, that's atypical. Anyone who left the fruits there didn't think the animal was going to eat it, you're liable for damages. That's option number 1. And then we say, mechazeret is a machloka between Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda on one side, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Elazar on the other. To which the Gemara says, lo. No, you could say either yes, either no. It doesn't either go like Rav, go like Shmuel. That's not what they're talking about. V'hacha, and here's the explanation I gave in the beginning. Their machloket is, what does it mean? Remember, bi'er b'stei achel, when are you going to be chayav and shen? That's how we got to this whole thing. If you do it in someone else's field, what did we say someone else's field is? The individual's field where the food is, right? Which came to exclude, it actually excludes 2 things. It excludes the public domain and it excludes my domain. Let's say it's right, or let's go back to Ruth and Naomi. Ruth's animal eats Naomi's food in Ruth's domain. Ruth brought her food into Ruth's domain, right? Ruth is not liable for that. So, so Tanakam, the first people, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda hold that when they said they hold when they said Tanakama means the first ones, which is Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda hold bi'er b'stei achel means only in Naomi's property is Ruth's animal going to be liable because she walked into Naomi's property. But in Reshut Rabim or Ruth's property, no. That's the first approach. That's what we've been learning until now. Umar Sabal, the others hold, Bi'er b'stechil, below b'reshut hamazik. Bi'er b'stechil means somewhere else, not in your own property. In your own property, if the animal eats someone else's food, that's their problem for bringing the food. But anywhere else, including the public domain, the animal's liable. And then that's exactly how I suggested reading Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Elazar, which is, an animal, the expectation is they're just walking. So you're not going to be liable, right? If it then goes and eats, you're liable because, again, if it's expected, then the owner of the food should not have left their food. But if it's not expected, then it wasn't your fault for leaving the food. It was my fault that my animal ate your food. So now they say, no, that can't possibly be. Okay, why not? So again, so they say, wait, there's a pasuk that has to tell you that if Naomi brings her food into Ruth's garden and Ruth's animal eats the food, Ruth is liable. You don't need a pasuk for that. Lema parach b'reshute mabai. Lema perach b'reshute mabai. Ruth could say, your fruit's in my field. What are they doing here? Why'd you bring them into my field? I'm not paying for that. That's totally obvious. You don't need a special drasha to teach you that, which means it must be, Bi'er b'stechil really means only the nizak, and it actually excludes Reshut Rabim, and therefore they reject that reading of Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Elazar. It can't be they're saying that, even though I will suggest it could be they were saying that. It's just the Amoraim couldn't imagine someone had an approach like that because it was so obvious to them, just like it's obvious to us after learning the sugya, that shen and Reshut Rabim, you're not obligated, but maybe it wasn't so obvious. Maybe there really was this other position. But the Gemara doesn't like to take that explanation. They say, maybe they're arguing about what Ilf and Rabbi Yoshai disagreed about, or mentioned, actually, not disagreed. But let's go back. Rabbi Yoshai and Ilfa, in the other yesterday's stuff, they said what? If you could have a private domain and a public domain, it's on the animal's back, right? If the animal jumps up, that's already not expected, and that's already Reshut Yachid. It's like that was in someone's private domain, right? You had a package and they jumped up and ate it. So maybe that's the issue. Means that's not expected and you have to pay for it. Whereas Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda would say maybe you do have to pay for it. Okay, so let me just check. Rabbi Meir savar mitoch rechava leolam patur. Right, you're not okay. So Rabbi Meir would hold, is that what I just said? That you're always exempt. Right, that's exactly what I said. You're always going to be exempt in the public domain, no matter what, and even if it's on the animal's back. And when they say, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yossi, no, they might walk and eat, but they don't jump up and do it. And they don't take it off another animal's back. So if they do, then they're liable. And then Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Elazar hold by that position of Rabbi Yoshaya and Ilfa, but not Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, that's it for Shane. So let's just review that before we move on. So now we got to this whole thing. Is there a machloka b'mechazeret? Is there a machloka Rav and Shmuel? Is there a machloka Tanaim? In the end, it's not clear there's a machloka Rav and Shmuel, and it's not clear there's a machloka Tanaim about it. Because both, we said maybe the machloka Rav and Shmuel is something else, and then we brought this machloka Tanaim, and we suggested two other readings as to what the machloka is. Now we get to a new Mishna, which I always think is like a kind of funny one. You try to imagine the scenario. So we have a dog or a goat that's at the top of a roof, and they jump up and they smash kelim as they jump down off the roof. You have to pay full damages. You put an animal on the top of the roof, what are you expecting? Of course, they're going to jump down. And because the kelim are at the bottom, well, they broke them. Yeah, that's obvious. So you're responsible. This case we saw already. We'll deal with this more further on. The dog takes a cake, which had a coal attached to it, and goes to this pile of wheat or hay or whatever it is. Ate the cake, dropped the coal or put down the coal. We had a machloket, is this straw or is it Karen? On the cake that they ate, that's shen. And on the fire that they created and the damage they did there, has to pay chatzi nezek because that was atypical, or it was tzrorot. Again, we had a debate. We'll leave that for, right, we actually discussed that already. We'll get a little bit more into this case. Where was this? Whose field? What's what? We'll talk about that later. Not today. Now the Gemara starts off and says, Tama de kaptsu. Notice it says they jumped off the roof, which seems to imply hanaflu. If you put them on the roof and then they fell off, patur, you'd be exempt. Now, This leads into another. We just had this big topic of Hadar b'chatzar chaviro. It's another big topic that comes up in a lot of sugyot, which is called tchilato b'pshia v'sofo ba'ones. Let's say you started and did something negligent. You put animals on top of the roof, and there were kalim at the bottom, which could have been broken because likely they were going to jump. But in the end, they don't jump. They just happen to fall off in some freak accident. Okay? Now, that's called tchilato b'pshia. You started with pshia. You did something negligent, but in the end, the damage happened ba'ones. It wasn't expected damage. It didn't happen the way it could have happened. So there's a machloka whether you're patur or chayav here, because you were negligent. On the other hand, it happened not because of your negligence. So because the Mishna says kaptzu only and doesn't say naflu, they fell, seems to say that tchilato b'pshia v'sofo ba'ones would be exempt. Tanya Namihachi, there's even a braita to support our reading of the Mishnah, that it inferred from there is you're going to be exempt if they fell, because it says exactly that. That's just a quote from same as our Mishnah. Then it says naflu pturin, if they fell, they're exempt. So now, right, first we just inferred it. Here the braita says it explicitly, to which the Gemara says, well, now if we have this braita that says it explicitly, fits very well with the person who holds you were negligent in the beginning, but in the end, honest happened. It was beyond your control. What happened in the end? You're exempt. But if you say you're liable, how can you explain it? Well, I think of a pool. When you fall into a pool, you could fall in right next to the wall. But if you jump in, you know how to jump, you're not going to jump right next to the wall, right? Little kids, you have to teach them not to. But once you know how to jump, you're going to jump, right? Laws of physics, right? You're going to jump outward. Let's say the kalim, you have the kelev and the gedi at the top of the roof. By the way, they don't die, okay? This isn't dangerous for the animal. The animal knows how to jump, right? It's the problem is they're going to fall and land right on kalim and break them. So now, if the kalim were up against the wall, you had no expectation that they were going to jump and break the kalim. So it wasn't even shi'iya. What happened though? When they fell, they slid down next to the wall and they broke the kalim. That would be a case, the way if you hold is chayav. In this case, you wouldn't be chayav because it wasn't pshia, because there was no expectation they were going to break those kelim, even if if the normal typical thing had happened. Could be a case where it falls where you be chayav. What would that be? If you had a wall that was falling apart, to which they say, what are you talking about? Well, what do you have to worry? That the wall would start falling apart, the tiles would fall off, or the bricks would fall and it would fall and collapse and then break something? But but in the end, again, if the wall was falling apart and the animal jumped, again, that's it didn't fall apart because the wall was, fell. The animal fell not because the wall was falling apart, right? That's not what we're talking about here. It just happened to be the wall could have fallen apart, but it didn't. So then I don't understand. It should be which we just said, right? You're likely exempt. To which they said, no. It was in a very narrow wall. And because it was falling apart, the animal went to this very narrow part of the wall and fell because the wall was going to fall apart. And that's what caused the fall. And that's why you could be responsible. So that's a case of nafal where you would actually be liable. Okay, with that, we'll finish today's daf and wishing everybody a good day. I'm hoping for some good news today. See you all tomorrow.